May 11th, 1945. What happens this week? This week, the war in Europe ends. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Joseph Goebbels, and Martin Bormann all died. The Battle of Berlin ended, the war in Italy ended, the Burma campaign ended, but there was still fighting in many places. China, Okinawa, Central Europe, and the Australians landed on Tarakan Island, beginning the Borneo campaign. The world's focus was generally on Europe, though, with the fall of Berlin. This week on the 5th, at Reims in France, formal negotiations for Germany's surrender begin. On the 6th, Alfred Jodl, the Wehrmacht's operations chief, flies to Reims at 6:30, joining German Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg. A Soviet liaison officer is there, General Ivan Susloparov. Now, Jodl is empowered to offer simultaneous surrender on all fronts, but he tries at first to surrender only those German forces facing the Western Allies. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower says either surrender all Germans facing any direction, or he'll stop negotiations and seal off the Western Front, which would prevent any more Germans heading from east to west to give themselves up to the Western Allies instead of the Soviets. Just after midnight, Jodl tells this to Karl Dönitz, who is the head of state and commander of the armed forces since Hitler's suicide. Jodl says, "I see no way out but to sign." Dönitz says, "Do it." At 2:41, the very early morning of the 7th, Germany surrenders unconditionally to the Allies. Well, this produces a storm from the east. Red Army Chief of Staff Alexei Antonov complains to Eisenhower that though the surrender talks were designed to effect simultaneous surrender, Dönitz had still been ordering fighting in the east, so the Soviets have the impression that this is a separate truce with the West. And furthermore, it should have been signed in Berlin by Georgy Zhukov. Susloparov has no authority to sign an act of surrender. Joseph Stalin makes all this clear in a phone call to Zhukov. It was the Soviet people rather than the Allies who had borne the main brunt of the war, and, therefore, the Germans should sign their surrender before the supreme command of the entire anti-Hitler coalition, and not merely in the presence of the Western Supreme Commander. The Reims document could only be a preliminary protocol of surrender, while the formal signing would take place in Berlin on the 8th of May, with the German High Command in attendance and in the presence of the Supreme Command of the Allies. That's right, the Germans will sign another surrender the 8th in Berlin. There's also this. Stalin remained adamant. For years, the Nazis had claimed that the German army in World War I was never defeated, in part because the armistice had been signed on French soil. No such canard would be tolerated this time. What's actually going on in the East this week, though? Last week, the Soviets captured Berlin, and their armies drove to the Baltic and the Elbe. Soviet command believes they have destroyed at least 70 German infantry, 12 panzer, and 10 motorized divisions, taking 480,000 POWs, capturing 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 10,000 artillery pieces and mortars. 100,000, or perhaps even 125,000, civilians died in Berlin. Another 100,000 or so German soldiers were killed in the campaign, and over 200,000 wounded. And the Soviets had around 80,000 soldiers killed, but over 250,000 wounded. All told, that's at least 1.25 million people killed, wounded, or heading for prison camps in the Soviet Union, from which a great many will likely never return. As this week gets going, though, the Red Army is still fighting the Germans at a bunch of places. There's fighting on the Vistula Spit, near Olomouc in Czechoslovakia, near St. Pölten in Austria, and around Breslau in Silesia. Still, the surrenders keep coming, as they did late last week. On the 5th, at Baldham in Bavaria, all the German forces between the Bohemian Mountains and the Upper Inn River unconditionally surrendered to Jake Devers. Olomouc falls May 6 to elements of the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts, But just that campaign, the past few weeks, has cost the Soviets 38,400 more killed and 140,000 wounded, which is not small potatoes. But at least those forces can now head for Prague. So the Soviets then have 1st, 2nd, and 4th Ukrainian Front focusing on Prague, which is a total of 153 divisions of various types, nearly 25,000 big guns and mortars, 2,100 tanks and self-propelled guns, 4,000 combat planes, and the 1st Czechoslovak Corps, the 1st Independent Czech Armored Brigade, the 2nd Polish Army, and the 1st and 4th Romanian armies. They'll have to deal with German Army Group Center and the remnants of Group Ostmark, which is like 62 divisions total. So, 1st Ukrainian attacks from west of Dresden, 2nd Ukrainian from south of Brno, and 4th from Olomouc. The Prague operation has been scheduled to begin the 7th. The orders went out last week on the 2nd. Hey, here's a new wrinkle. Eisenhower now thinks that once his forces have secured the line from Karlovy Vary to Pilsen, then an advance on Prague is doable and practical. So he tells Antonov, which provokes a pretty sharp reaction, that he should not do this. 1st Ukrainian Front Commander Ivan Konyev underlines this the 5th when U.S. 12th Army Group Commander Omar Bradley visits his front headquarters. He says, no American help is necessary, and the U.S. should stick to the agreed-upon demarcation line. Unaware of this profound change in the situation, but excited by the news of the American advance into Bohemia, the citizens of Prague took to the streets in spontaneous fashion the afternoon of the 4th of May, tearing down German street signs or dabbing them with patriotic slogans. Such was the speed, spontaneity, and extent of this mass demonstration that the insurgent planners were taken by surprise, and their carefully nurtured schemes for an organized rising thrown into disarray. Yep, see, there has been an uprising planned for the 7th, but it pretty much begins the 4th. And so, on the 5th, Prague Radio broadcasts the appeal for all citizens to take part, and the Czechoslovak National Front agrees to lead the uprising. Prague is finally going to war. That evening, the radio announces that they have control of much of Greater Prague and asks the population to help set up barricades against the German armor soon to come. After 9 p.m., they announce the German city administration no longer exists, and many of its men are prisoners. These announcements all seem pretty optimistic so far. But at 12:53 comes the call to the Americans. Send your tanks. Send tanks and aircraft. Help save Prague. And through the night, repeated calls go out for Soviet and British help. There is one other notable appeal at 3:28 a.m. that goes out specifically to Vlasov's army. I've talked about these guys a few times before. This is the armed forces of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, KONR, a collaborationist force working with the Germans to fight against the Soviets. The 1st Division, under Sergei Bunyachenko, was badly savaged attacking Soviet positions near Frankfurt on Oder in mid-April. Andrei Vlasov himself happened to arrive in Prague April 16th, and Bunyachenko managed to take the division south, miraculously avoiding fighting the Soviets while also avoiding being dragged into German Army Group Center, and crossed the border into Czechoslovakia in late April. These 25,000 men have been camped near Prague. Since they got there, Czech partisans have been trying to convince Bunyachenko to change sides and help the planned armed uprising. He saw some possible salvation in this because, let's face it, since both Vlasov and Bunyachenko are former Soviet generals who turned traitor, they will be killed if the Soviets get their hands on them. But in early May, even as Vlasov sent out emissaries to the Americans to hopefully end up in their hands, Bunyachenko's men began taking their fate in their own hands and killing German soldiers. Vlasov angrily confronts Bunyachenko about this, changing sides again, supporting the Czechs and openly breaking with the Germans. Bunyachenko says the Czechs will repay them for it by giving them shelter in their newly liberated state. Vlasov disputed this violently, arguing that breaking with the Germans would be odious treachery aimed at German soldiers who had at least kept their word, while assisting the Czechs could avail little or nothing since the Red Army would soon be in Prague. Bunyachenko waved this aside, asserting that the Germans deserved their fate, and KONR commanders must now act to save their men, a view supported vehemently by other officers of the 1st Division. Vlasov could do no more. Well, as I said, the radio appeal goes out to them the early morning hours of the 6th. Early on the 7th, Vlasov makes the break with the Germans, the 1st Division taking on the SS, fighting into the city and securing places like the aerodrome and the radio station. At 5:07 a.m., he calls on the Germans in Greater Prague to unconditionally surrender or be destroyed. However, he soon gets an unwelcome shock. The National Front informs Bunyachenko that not only do they not want anything to do with traitors and mercenaries in general, but many of the members are communists, and Vlasov and Bunyachenko are by definition enemies of communism. Here's another twist. 3 U.S. Army vehicles arrive in the Prague suburbs, and the radio announces that it's a full-scale arrival by both the British and the Americans. However, the Americans go back to behind the Pilsen line as agreed upon, which makes Bunyachenko think, crap, I better go to them and possible salvation if they're not going to help here. German command also wants to get away from everyone they can get away from, so Bunyachenko's men now join with the SS troops to break out of the city to avoid what they both dread the most, capture by the Red Army. Now, Fyodor Truhin, Vlasov's chief of staff, has another group of KONR troops who've been south of Prague lately after arriving from Austria May 1st. He has, by this time, already started his own negotiations with the Americans, who order him to bring his troops to the American lines, lay down their arms, and surrender within 36 hours. He sends the word to Bunyachenko to bring his guys to join in all this, but gets no reply. So he and his deputy chief of staff, Vladimir Boyarsky, go out on an urgent mission to find him so surrender to the Americans can happen. In Przybam, they run into a Czech partisan unit with a Red Army captain in command. Boyarsky is hanged on the spot after slapping the captain, and Truhin is turned over to the Red Army. Or maybe that's not quite how it happens. Sources differ quite a bit. It may also be that Truhin, after handing over his force to the Americans, learns Vlasov's location and about Bunyachenko's defection, and is heading to see them with another KONV general, Mikhail Shapovalov, when they are caught by the partisans outside Przybam the 8th, who execute Shapovalov and take Truhin to the Soviets. As for Boyarsky, in that scenario, he gets orders from Truhin the 5th to go to Prague to meet Bunyachenko, and in Przybam the 7th, the partisans get him, and he's executed there. But that's just one little story, and bigger events are catching up with the smaller ones all over. Radio Prague, of course, broadcasts the contents of the Reichs document, and the document does make clear that total surrender applies to both Eastern and Western fronts. The German surrender in Prague is then pretty quickly enacted with Czech assistance, and that is it for Vlasov and Bunyachenko's hopes too. They are captured like 40 kilometers southeast of Pilsen by the Soviet 25th Tank Corps. Surrender to the Americans has been rejected. Ivan Konyev's tanks are racing for Prague by this time. He launches his offensive already the 6th, one day early, when Recon says there are no continuous German lines ahead of him. So he's got force aiming for Dresden, Breslau, and Prague. Breslau finally surrenders that day at 6 p.m. This fortress town has held out for 3 months. On the 7th, 4th Guards and 3rd Guards tank armies batter their way towards Dresden. On the 8th, as German High Command proceeds under guard to Berlin to reenact their surrender, 13th Army and 3rd Guards Army are across the Czech border. And also, Malinovsky's front has now started its offensive from the southeast of Prague. So while Wehrmacht commander Wilhelm Keitel is signing the surrender in Berlin, the Red Army is fighting Ferdinand Schörner's Army Group Center. Stalin suggests to his allies that they wait until the surrenders actually take effect and then announce it publicly May 9th at 7 p.m. Moscow time. But the Western Allies do not wait. So while the Western capitals erupt in jubilation the 8th, the cannons in Moscow do fire a salute for the fall of Dresden. Konyev does send the surrender order to all German units in front of him at 8 p.m. the 8th, giving them 3 hours to comply. When they have not done so at 11, he orders all 12 of his armies to resume operations. Lelyashenko's tanks of 4th Guards Tank Army reached Prague a few hours after midnight. Rybalko's tanks reached the northern suburbs around 6 a.m. They are joined within a couple hours by rifles, and just after noon the 9th, the lead elements of Malinovsky's front link up with them in the center of the city. As for Army Group Center Commander Ferdinand Schörner, he reported last week to command that he had a tight hold over his men and had begun producing ammunition and gasoline for his army group. On the 8th, an OKW colonel with an American escort goes to Schörner's headquarters to see about the surrender. Schörner says, well, he gave the orders, but now says he doesn't really have the means to see that they're carried out everywhere. The OKW need neither have worried that Schörner would attempt a last-ditch battle, nor have hoped that he would find a means to extricate his army group. Schörner deserted his troops on the 8th, and in civilian clothes flew a light plane out of Czechoslovakia. What else? On the 8th, under Dönitz orders, Karl Hilpert unconditionally surrenders the troops in the Courland pocket. That same day, what's left of Josef Tisso's Slovak Republic surrenders to Walton Walker's 20th Corps in Kremensmünster, Austria. Here's some interesting numbers. German Army Command calculates the actual strength of all German armed forces, all branches of service, on the Eastern Front at the time the surrender goes into effect. Army Group Courland, 200,000. Army Group East Prussia, 100,000. Army Group Center, 600,000. Army Group Ostmark, 430,000. Southwestern Theater, 180,000. That is 1,510,000 men. Of these, 1.25 million go into Soviet captivity. Only Army Group Ostmark manages to save a big part of its force from going into Soviet or Yugoslav captivity. On the 7th, just south of the Isle of May in the Firth of Forth, U-2336 sinks 2 merchant ships, 1 British and 1 Norwegian. 7 Norwegian and 2 British seamen died. These are the last Allied naval deaths of the European War. In the 5 years and 8 months of the submarine war, Germany has lost 27,491 men in it, and of the 863 U-boats that actually went on patrols, 754 have been sunk or wrecked. They, however, have sunk 2,800 Allied merchant ships and 148 warships. There are, or rather were, a bunch of German submarines still left as May began, like 470 of them, of which 170 were operational and mainly based in Norway. Operation Rainbow began last week, the scuttling of the U-boat fleet to avoid surrendering them. From the first scuttling May the 1st to the 7th, at least 195 U-boats are scuttled. The remainder surrender on the 8th in a variety of places: Norway, Denmark, Germany, France, at sea. 2 will surrender when they reach Argentina, and 2 are scuttled in Portuguese waters. Funny though, the Rainbow order to scuttle is given the 5th. But like I said, the scuttling began the 1st, and half of the subs are scuttled before the order is given. So it's hard to say if the order really had any effect at all, or even if it was really fully issued. The commanders were scuttling anyhow. On the 9th, the German garrison on the Channel Islands surrenders. That same day, the German troops on Bornholm surrender. In Austria, on the 5th, there is a remarkable battle at Schloss Itter, but that I already covered in a little extra episode 6 days ago when it happened. As for the Polish situation, I talked last week about it, but there is more to say, particularly with respect to Yugoslavia. Back on April 18th, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and US President Harry Truman pressed Stalin about the formation of a Polish government of national unity as agreed upon at Yalta, and not an automatic application of the Yugoslav precedent. Stalin rejects this, saying the current Polish provisional government should be the basis for the reconstructed government of national unity, as agreed. But by rejecting the Yugoslav example, they are rejecting the Polish provisional government as the basis. I mentioned last week some of what Churchill wrote to Stalin April 29th, but he had other stuff to say in that note. He said basically that the Yugoslav precedent does not at all apply to Poland, since the consultation period, though agreed upon at Yalta, was dramatically shortened, and the Soviets signed their own treaty with the Lublin Poles, and They agreed last year to have 50-50 Soviet-British influence in Yugoslavia post-war. But Josip Tito has not only proclaimed that his loyalties lie towards the Soviets, but rigged the consultation there so that 25 of his nominees are in the government, as opposed to only 6 from the Royal Yugoslav government. Doing the same in Poland would mean that for every 4 members of the government Stalin wants, there'd be just 1 representing democratic elements. Stalin wrote back the 4th, that not accepting the provisional Polish government as the basis for the new one means there is no possibility of any agreement on the Polish question. The European war might be over this week, but there is still active fighting on 5 fronts the other side of the world. The Japanese counteroffensive on Okinawa continues as the week begins. Japanese infantry hits the boundary between U.S. 77th and 7th Divisions, penetrating far enough to take Tanabaru at dawn, but American counterattacks the 5th and 6th just savage the Japanese there, and fewer than half of the attackers make it back to Japanese lines after dark the 6th. This was the last Japanese thrust for what turns out to be a brief series of attacks. They take like 7,000 total casualties for the whole operation, and they cause only around 700, so it is very much a failure. The plan now is to rebuild their lines with rear echelon troops, service troops, and fight a war of attrition. They have lost half of their artillery and have to seriously regulate ammunition for the big guns as well. As for the Americans, if they can push south, they'll be able to get a 4th Division into the lines. And so this week, 1 regiment, the 22nd, from 6th Marine Division goes into the lines. The rested 96th Infantry Division released the 7th on the 8th, and today, 10th Army begins a new full offensive. In China, the Chinese counterattacks in Western Hunan gather steam, pushing the Japanese back. 5th Division leads the charge north of Wugang. To the south, Xining is taken back on the 6th by elements of the 44th Division. On Tarakan off the coast of Borneo, the Tarakan airstrip is secured the 5th. And that is David Whitehead's Australian 26th Brigade Group's main job. But of course, the Japanese still hold the interior of the island, so nothing is secure. Australian Commander Thomas Blamey does an inspection tour the 8th, giving the brigade the go-ahead to secure the rest of the island, but to do it methodically and deliberately. A pioneer battalion begins their advance already the 7th east of Tarakan town, but on the 10th, they're stopped for the rest of the week. On New Guinea, on the 11th, Wewak falls to the Australians. Farida Force, which is mainly commandos, lands at Dove Bay this day to try to surround the town, and 19th Brigade begins its assault on Wewak last week. They occupy Wewak Airfield, though the fighting around that continues. In the Philippines on Luzon, a new phase of the Shimbu battle begins this week, the fight for the Ipoh Dam. Now, this is pretty important to the fight for Luzon, so I'm going to talk a bunch about it next week and backtrack to cover the events of this week there. As for the fight against the Shobu group in the north, that is further developing, and I will talk about that as well next week, as well as several events there the past weeks that I have also not had time lately to cover. And here are some notes to end the week. On the 5th, Japanese balloon warfare, the Fugo campaign, claims its only lives. 5 kids and a woman from a Sunday school group near Bly, Oregon. The balloon has apparently laid undisturbed on the ground for a month or more, but it carried an anti-personnel bomb, which is somehow detonated. On the 8th, to better prepare to eventually disarm the Japanese in Vietnam, the puppet state there made that name official the 4th, the Allies theoretically divide the country at the 16th parallel. The Chinese nationalists will disarm them north of this, and the British south of it. There are a couple of notable suicides this week in Europe. On the 8th, that of Josef Terboven, Reichskommissar in Norway, and on the 10th, that of Konrad Henlein. In case you were wondering what happened to Hermann Goering, who was put under house arrest 2 weeks ago, Martin Bormann had ordered him executed if Berlin fell, but that didn't happen, and Bormann died last week. Goering begins this week at Mauterndorf Castle in Austria. He is freed by a Luftwaffe unit, the 5th, and goes to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. He's taken into custody the 6th. And the week ends with the end of the war in Europe, but still a lot of fighting in China and various islands in the Western Pacific and around the South China Sea. What else happens this week? Celebrations happen this week. In Paris, the party lasts the 6th to the 9th, and the Arc de Triomphe is lit up for the first time in years. In London, the balls of St. Paul's ring out... What?
You said the balls of St. Paul.
In London, the bells of St. Paul's ring out as grey skies turn sunny towards noon on the 8th. Hundreds of pubs grow full of thousands of crates of whiskey and gin labelled not to be sold until victory night. The King and Queen appear to the crowds outside of Buckingham Palace 6 times that day. In the House of Commons, Winston Churchill reads the surrender announcement to a standing ovation. In Moscow, a crowd of many thousands even gather in front of the American embassy to celebrate with their ally. A crowd of 500,000 fills Times Square and its environs in New York. In Washington, D.C., the Capitol is lit up for the first time since December 1941. I'm sure, wherever you are watching this, your people have been busy celebrating these past few days.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters,
the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
Подписан акт о безоговорочной капитуляции германских вооруженных сил.
But the war is not over. A big part of it is. The European Axis powers have all been defeated. The war in Europe is over. And millions of men must be grateful, lucky, happy they survived and can now return home to their families. But millions more are still fighting the war. In China, on Okinawa, Borneo, New Guinea, the Philippines. And the endings of those fights, well, who knows when they will end? And for men there, by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, they won't be so lucky. And they won't be so happy. And they damn sure won't be grateful because they will be dead. And their families will grieve. And their friends will grieve. And their worlds will never be the same. Because make no mistake, war is hell. This series has covered the European War for 298 weeks. It will continue to cover the war in Asia and the Pacific for as long as that lasts. We will return to Europe here soon in a series chronologically covering, as we always do, the events that led to the war. Breaking the timeline completely now. On June 25th, we begin week-by-week coverage of the Korean War. All of these series, everything we do, is financed by the Time Ghost Army. So please join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com or continue your service so we can continue to bring you these series. I don't think it's egotistical to say that what we are doing is important because it objectively just plain is. See you next time.